When you hear will to power, you probably think this must be my most radical idea. Domination, control, the strong taking from the weak. But this interpretation couldn't be more wrong. What I was actually describing is something you have felt yourself, probably this week, possibly today. And once you understand what I was actually pointing at, the version you have been working with starts to look embarrassingly shallow. So what does the concept actually mean? Why is the misreading so persistent? And what changes when you finally see it clearly? Let's find out. The popular version of will to power goes roughly like this. I believe that the fundamental drive in human beings is the desire to dominate, to gain control over other people, resources, circumstances. In this reading, power means what it means in everyday political language: influence, authority, the capacity to make others do what you want. It is the version that made the concept so easy to recruit into fascist ideology, and it is probably the version you encountered first. The problem is that this reading collapses under the weight of my actual argument. If the will to power were fundamentally about power over others, then the people most fully expressing it would be the ones at the top of whatever hierarchy you care to name. The ones who had won, and I had almost nothing but contempt for those people, which is a strange position for someone who supposedly believed domination was the highest expression of human drive. My critique of what I had called herd mentality was actually aimed at people who had achieved social dominance through conformity, through becoming exactly what the group rewarded. Those who suppressed everything individual and difficult in themselves in exchange for status and approval. These people had power over others in the most obvious sense. However, I thought they were among the least powerful people alive, because what they had purchased their position with was themselves. And if you are honest with yourself, you probably know at least one person who fits that description. By the way, if you find this kind of thinking interesting, make sure to subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from. Anyhow, what I was actually pointing toward was something internal. Power as a force that moves through you, a drive toward expansion, expression, the push against whatever is currently limiting you. I saw this as the fundamental drive in human beings, and once you see what I actually meant by it, you will not be able to unsee it. The clearest way into what I meant is through a concept I considered central to the whole framework: self-overcoming. The German word is Selbstüberwindung, and it describes a process rather than a destination. The continuous surpassing of a previous version of yourself, knowing that identity is not a fixed thing you own, but an ongoing project you are either engaged in or abandoning. Think about that for a moment. It applies to you directly. Every time you have pushed through something difficult and come out different on the other side, that is what I am talking about. Although before getting into what will to power actually is, you should know where the confusion originated. You probably don't know this, but I never actually wrote The Will to Power. After my mental collapse in 1889, my sister Elizabeth took control of my unpublished notebooks and assembled them into a volume, presenting it to the world as my masterwork. It was a selective editorial construction built from private fragments I had never prepared for publication, arranged in a sequence that emphasized hierarchy, domination, and strength in ways my actual published philosophy never did. The book became enormously influential, was enthusiastically adopted by the Nazi regime, and shaped how several generations of readers, most likely including whoever first explained me to you, understood a concept that the real me had meant something almost entirely different by. The Will to Power, as most people encountered it, was Elizabeth's book. The will to power as a philosophical concept was something else entirely. What I actually wrote about was a drive toward expansion, the fundamental tendency in living things to push beyond their current state, to increase the capacity to act and create rather than simply maintain what's already there. I introduced the concept formally in Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 1883 and developed it across Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morality in the years that followed. In those published works, the concept is clearly a description of a biological and psychological force that is already operating in you, whether you recognize it or not. I use the artist as my clearest example. What the artist does is impose form on chaos, taking undifferentiated experience, emotion, perception, and forcing it into a shape that did not exist before. The act of shaping, of bringing something out of nothing, was, for me, the purest expression of what will to power actually looks like. In my framework, some of the highest expressions of power look like restraint, delayed gratification, the discipline to not act on an impulse because you are building towards something that requires the impulse to be controlled, the person who can hold tension without releasing it, who can sit with difficulty without resolving it prematurely, is expressing more will to power than the person who simply acts on every drive the moment it appears. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Immediate domination is easy. Transformation takes longer and costs more, which is precisely why I thought it was the higher form. You cannot decide what feelings you will have. What you can decide is whether you understand them clearly enough to work with them instead of against them. That distinction is where everything changes. Modern culture has a very specific relationship with discomfort, and I found it clarifying in the worst possible way. The dominant framework positions happiness, comfort, and stability as the goals, the metrics by which your life is going well. Restlessness, on the other hand, is treated as a symptom. The desire for more is treated as a pathology, something to be managed or medicated or resolved through the right consumption choices. If you have ever been told that wanting more than you have is a sign that something is wrong with you, you have encountered the very value system I was arguing against. What I would tell you is that your restlessness is information about your nature. The drive to push past your current limits is the expression of the same force I thought was fundamental to life itself. That suppressing it produces the particular kind of stagnation that looks like stability from the outside and feels like slow suffocation from the inside. If that description lands for you personally, it is probably worth sitting with why. The practical shift this produces is closely tied to the difference between running from resistance and choosing the kind of resistance that is actually connected to something you are trying to become. The person who avoids every uncomfortable challenge in the name of well-being is not expressing will to power. Neither is the person who courts difficulty randomly, who mistake suffering for growth. The concept is more precise than either of those. It points toward a specific orientation, the intentional selection of obstacles that are larger than your current capacity, chosen with the explicit intention of expanding that capacity. Failure in this framework is not the opposite of power, it is one of its primary mechanisms. The feedback you get from genuine failure is information you cannot get any other way. I thought the avoidance of failure was one of the clearest signs that someone had confused comfort with strength, that they had prioritized the feeling of competence over the process of becoming competent. You already know which of those you have been doing. Most people do. The deepest implication is about authorship. My argument is ultimately that a life organized around externally inherited values, those you receive from your culture, your family, your social group, without ever seriously examining whether they are actually yours, is a life in which your will to power is being expressed on someone else's behalf. The only way to truly be powerful is creating your own set of values and living by them, making authorship. In the end, the old definition, power as control over others, is not just a philosophically wrong. It is also, if you look at the people living by it, not particularly effective. The ones who have organized their lives around accumulating dominance over other people tend to end up dependent on that dominance in ways that look a lot more like weakness than strength. I saw that clearly enough in the 19th century. It has not changed. What I was pointing at is already operating in you. The only question worth asking is whether you are directing it at something worthy of it, or whether you are letting the culture around you answer that question on your behalf. Now, where in your life are you expressing genuine will to power? And where are you mistaking comfort for strength? Drop us a comment, subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next video.